growing up, I didn't have any connection to our traditional customs because it was held up as two options. You either are Kikuyu and you don't have anything to do with Christianity, or you are a Christian and you don't have anything to do with Kikuyu culture. And that's a constant tension even today in Kenya, but then more broadly in Africa, of how do I be an African and a Christian when for so long we were told that you can't have both.
This is Out of the Margins podcast.
The podcast space, especially in the Christian world, is saturated by Western voices. But if we want a diversity of thought to face the future together, we need to step back and hear voices from out of the margins.
Here, we will be offering insights from experiences and perspectives from the majority world. My name is Edgar.
And I'm Simon.
And on each episode, we will be bringing to you our conversations with pastors, leaders, and scholars from the majority world.
This podcast is brought to you by Young Langham, Australia.
Now, in this episode, we will talk about contextualization. Contextualization is about making the message of the gospel relevant to a particular context. Now, the reason why this is important is because we want to hear from voices from the majority world, voices that reflect a different perspective. So, talking about contextualization in this episode highlights why understanding the context is so important when presenting the gospel. Now, in this episode, we will be chatting with Crystal, Kamwende, and Joseph. Crystal is from East Asia, Kamwende is from Kenya, and Joseph is from Uganda. And we will be hearing about how the gospel has taken shape in these different contexts. So let's just go ahead and listen to the conversation. So welcome, and can you guys just introduce yourself, like just short introduction, like your name, your background, Crystal?
Yeah, so I'm Crystal. I am from Asia, but I'm now doing my PhD study in Australia.
Awesome.
I'm Kamwende and I am from Kenya, and I am currently serving as an associate pastor in Australia and married to a Mexican.
I'm the guy.
I'm Joseph. I am from Kampala, Uganda, and I'm doing my PhD in New Testament Studies at Ridley College here in Melbourne.
Awesome. Like I said, we're talking about contextualization, and I like this definition by Byamukama. He defines contextualization as making concepts or ideas relevant in a given situation. So in this case, we're talking about the church. How do we communicate the gospel? How do we make sure that it's contextualized properly? So to start with, can you guys share a little of experience you might have had, a funny experience of a cross-cultural moment?
Yeah, a funny experience of a cross-cultural moment. I would have to speak about tea. Yes. So one thing that struck me when I had my Master of Divinity in the US and also my time here in Melbourne is the fact that, well, Australians and Americans love taking a lot of water in little milk, or the other way around, little milk in a lot of water. And in Uganda, we actually have it the other way around. We have a lot of milk and little water. And so when you're ordering for tea in Kampala, they will ask you, do you need dry tea? Do you need milk tea? Do you need African tea? Now, the difference between milk tea and African tea is African tea has all the spices mixed, and milk tea is just milk. And dry tea is just water with tea leaves. And so just getting to notice that people elsewhere in the West do get a lot of water and just put in a little bit of milk was quite funny. I never understood why.
That's very surprising because for me, it was the first time in my life since I came to Australia and people asked me, do you want milk in your tea? Because growing up, we only have tea leaves and water.
Yeah. Yeah, in Uganda, that would be dry. And and in some places, they might not even ask you to pay if you order for that.
Like, it's not worth it.
Like, yeah, it's just not worth it.
Well, yeah, for me, tea is a constant issue in Australia. Every time they ask me, do you want tea? I'm like, oh gosh. Because either I have to explain how to make tea that I'll actually drink, or I just have to like accept the tea that they give me and then not drink it because I can't.
Yeah.
And so, and then the sugar aspect is the one. I remember coming here and I was asking, can I have some sugar with my tea?
Yeah.
And they'd be like, okay. And they go to the kitchen and you hear them rummaging in their cupboard trying to look for sugar, and they're like, oh, sorry, we only have brown sugar. Is that okay? I'm like, what do you mean? Why isn't there sugar on the table for the tea? And then there's a lot of judgment. If you put anything more than half a teaspoon, the sugar shaming. Oh my goodness. So they've shamed me down to about a teaspoon. But yeah.
No, I never take less than a teaspoon.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, very interesting conversation about tea, huh? So since we're talking about contextualization, can you guys share an example of contextualization done well or not done well, so that we know what we are talking about here?
Crystal, how about you go first with the good one?
Yeah, so maybe a bad one actually. It's food related as well. I do love hot pot and I love blood jelly. Have you had blood jelly before?
What is that? It's like blood sausage?
No, not sausage. Really, blood jelly, square shape. You put in hot pot. Anyway, try it. So I do love.
Wait, is it literally blood?
Blood, yes.
Oh boy.
Just purely blood, but in jelly form.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we put it in hot pot. I love it. But interestingly, most or some mainland Chinese Christians, they actually don't eat blood jelly because they think it's not holy. So I remember I went out having hot pot with some Chinese Christians and I ordered blood jelly, and I enjoyed my blood jelly so much that they started to doubt whether I'm actually a Christian.
Wow. There you go.
I think I did contextualization very bad.
You didn't recognize the cultural taboos.
Totally lost my credibility.
Wow. Yeah.
Wow.
There you go. Well, the example that I have is not from my own life, but from my family history. So my grandmother tells the story, and the interesting thing is that she tells it with a lot of pride. And she tells it of my great-grandmother, and how when she was young, so when the missionaries came to Kenya, what they did mostly was set up mission stations. And those mission stations were the operation base of the missionaries and where people would go if they wanted to become Christians. So my great-grandmother decided that she wants to become a Christian. But it's important to recognize that in that time, Christian, the word Christian was translated essentially to a read one, like someone who could read. And so to become a Christian was very strongly associated with being able to read. It was someone who could learn how to, the magic of words on paper is what they called it. And so she left her home, she left her people, and she went to the mission station. And the first thing that they did when you arrived at the mission station, as a woman, if you were a man, you were allowed to enter and leave, but as a woman, you had to stay. They took off all of your skins, so your traditional clothes that you were wearing, and they sewed up your ears, because as Kikuyu women, we used to have the elongated ears as one of our customs, and they shaved off all your hair. And then they gave you Western clothing, and they started teaching you how to read and basically how to live your life now on the mission station as a person who has now come into the Western culture. And my grandmother says it with a lot of pride because that was a huge thing for my great-grandmother to do. And that meant that my family has now been Christian for many generations. But it also meant that the second she stepped into that, she said goodbye to her religions, to her traditions, to her culture, to her family. She couldn't just go back and visit them, and she had to leave behind that. And that means that for me, growing up, I didn't have any connection to our traditional customs because it was held up as two options. You either are Kikuyu and you don't have anything to do with Christianity, or you are a Christian and you don't have anything to do with Kikuyu culture. Yeah. And that's a constant tension even today in Kenya, but then more broadly in Africa, of how do I be an African and a Christian when for so long we were told that you can't have both.
Yeah, and Joseph, just before you share your example, can you talk about that idea of identity, your African identity? Do you feel sometimes that is kind of fights your Christian identity?
Yeah, I usually call it a spiritual schizophrenia in a sense. So in your mind, you are raised as a Westerner in a way, but your heart screams, I am African. And maybe that ties into the example that I would share. There are quite a number that I could. But one of those being baptism. I do not know the origin or the genesis of the idea that when you are baptized, either into an Anglican church or Roman Catholic church, you necessarily have to obtain an English name. And so most of us, including me actually, I got my English name when I was baptized. And now, it might not have been intentional, but the message it communicates to many is that to become a Christian is to actually become a Westerner, to become a Briton or to become a European in that sense. And so it was quite a shock when we did not give English names to our two boys. Both our relatives and friends were asking, and these boys, are they not Christians? Like, yeah, well, of course, we will see how they decide. But what we will not do is to give them English names, because part of what needs to be done is to remove the misconception that to be a Christian has anything to do with being Western or being European or being English in that sense. So that's one example. And so what that then means is, as she mentioned, your attire, how you sort of dress, how you look, your expressions. If you are Christian, they tend to be sort of, and so the work that has to be done in terms of recognizing that actually God created all cultures, all people groups, all ethnicities, or ethne, if I might use that language. He created them, and in their unique distinctiveness, of course redeemed in a sense, but in their diversity, they communicate a way richer and more beautiful picture and understanding of who God is and what He has made us to be. That's much work, again, the work of contextualization that I suspect we will talk about.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. That's great. That's a great example. So now, talking about your specific context, what challenges you guys see in your context? Like, can I start with you, Joseph, again, with your ministry in Uganda? Can you talk about that a little bit, and what are the challenges in terms of contextualization?
So there are quite a number. Of course, one being that we have a people who are still trying to understand their identity, in the sense of course, from childhood they are trained in a different language, not in their heart language. And so whether it's science, social studies, or economics, or any mathematics and all that, their learning is in English right from childhood. But they're Africans, and there is a need for them to actually be able to be trained and taught to appreciate their context, their language, their culture, and all that. There is that aspect. But there is also the aspect that, as we try to think about that, there is modernization, there is internet, there is all these changes that are happening that make the idea of identity formation probably more challenging and difficult. Thirdly, the idea of the knowledge wealth that retells our African story is, well, of course, that tended to be stored in terms of stories and tales and those sort of conversations we have around fireplaces. But with the older generation dying out, the need to document that becomes quite more important, and yet the resources or the willingness to do that may not be as prevalent as possible. So those might be just three issues or challenges that have to be, and this is a resource intensive endeavor. And in a context like Uganda where I am, the majority would be looking for food to eat. They would be looking for a house to stay in. They have existential necessities that may not allow them, even if they wanted, to actually embark on the whole research project where they can be able to preserve and document these sort of stories and so much. And so the need for the resourcing, the training, and the desire to actually have the African story told. And I suspect as we share the gospel, as we minister, we have quite a role to play in that as the church in Uganda, the church in Africa, such as well.
Well, my context is difficult because it's there's several. So I'm from the Kenyan context, born and raised there, but then did my studies in Australia, and now I'm ministering in Australia. And then I'm married to Edgar, and so we are going to be moving to Mexico in the near future. And yes, so it's a bit complicated when I think about what are the challenges of my context, because there's a few of them.
It's a coat of many colors.
Yeah, exactly. But I'll talk about the Australian one because that's the most relevant for my current situation. And as a pastor in Australia, I think one of the big questions of contextualization is how to break through to a people whose worldview is essentially secular and who do not have really much of an understanding of the spirituality of the world. So because I'm Kenyan, I have a different worldview. I mean, it's different. And so I feel like I get to see the blind spots in Australian society more clearly because I'm coming from an outsider. And that's one of them that is hard. And even like in pastoral conversations and in preaching, in teaching, that's something that I'm often trying to emphasize because it's very lacking in the Australian worldview, and therefore, as a call of discipleship, then that's something that Australian Christians, I think, really need to grow in, understanding the world is spiritual, not just physical, and that will affect your everyday life. But at the same time, I feel like I am challenged by Australian society as well. So one of the things I was saying before was that one thing that you will always hear about Australians going to Kenya or just to Africa in general, they'll come back talking about the poor people and the beautiful animals. Always. Those are the two things. They're like, oh, what stuck out to you? Oh, the people are so poor. Oh, there's so much poverty. Oh, my goodness. And then we saw this person and they were a beggar. And then we saw that person and then this, da, da, da. And I get really irritated by that because it's building on the preconceptions that people already have of Africa. That people-wise, there's not much to see, but nature-wise, it's great. As if the people are just always struggling and there's nothing beautiful about us. And so I would primarily be irritated by that, and I think it also speaks to the shelteredness of Western context of they just have very little understanding of abject poverty, and so they're very shocked by it when they see it. But I've been feeling, especially recently, that God's been challenging me in that reaction of irritation that I have, because growing up in Kenya, you are surrounded by poverty, abject poverty. You see, like every 3 meters or something, when you're in the CBD of Nairobi, you will find a beggar of some kind. You will find a person who was mutilated in some way. You'll find very confronting things just walking along the street. But I wouldn't find them confronting because you see it every day. And because you have to have a certain practicality that says I can't stop and help every single person in need that I find. Yeah. I also need to move it with my life and be able to do things. I need to find ways to help people, but I can't just help everyone. And so when the Australian comes back and is talking about all that poverty, I think it has been, rather than irritating me so much, it's been confronting me in saying, look, they are sheltered, but because of that shelteredness, there is a softness of heart that they actually have to the poverty that they see. Mm-hmm. And that is something that is more in tune with the heart of God than my hard-heartedness, essentially, towards the poverty that I've experienced, or just the numbness, whatever you want to call it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that confronts me in thinking about my original context and the way in which Kenyans, affluent Kenyans, have to or just choose to ignore poverty to some extent or not engage with it as much and not be impacted by it as much, whereas the Australian comes back and is like, oh, that's really bad. It's bad that people live like that. That's something that grieves God, and we need to be grieved by God by that just as much. So, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so my ministry context is I'm training Asian pastors for ministry, and I can see that they have they struggle to reach out to the younger generation, so the second generation Asians in Australia. And I can see that on the one hand, they are like what Joseph just mentioned. They struggle to keep their traditions, to pass down their traditions. They are doing church in a certain way, and they want their second generation to keep their church traditions. This is, on the one hand, one struggle. On the other hand, they struggle to reach out to the second generation because the second generation grew up in Australia. They have their own unique culture, and the pastors, after so many years living in Australia, they still don't understand the second generation culture very well. And it relates to what Kamwende just mentioned about blind spot, because the second generation sees some blind spot that the first generation didn't see. So one example is older Asian pastors have no one to step up and to do the pastoral workload, and the reason is I've talked to some second generation Asians. So my ministry context is I train up Asian pastors, but my personal church life is I go to a second generation Asian church. And so I asked some people from church, their father is a pastor, a minister, and I asked them why they don't want to go into ministry. And a lot of them said because my church treated my father very badly. My father works 60 to 70 hours a week. I don't want that. But the first generation Asian pastors still see burnout as a badge of honor. We as ministers, we are to sacrifice for the Lord, so we have to work hard. But the second generation thinks it's not sustainable. I don't want to be like my father, so I don't want to go into ministry. There's always a cultural gap and generational gap, and how and I guess it challenges the Asian pastors to really think about why they do church in a particular way. Is it a cultural thing or is it a theological thing?
Yeah. Talking about that gap, because of different contexts, different generations, makes it more challenging to be able to connect with certain groups of people, and that's what contextualization is about, right? To connect. For a message to be familiar. So I want to talk about the fact that all of us here have studied in a Bible college in a Western context. So how do you think that has affected you, whether it blinds you or it helps you when doing ministry in your own context?
Yeah, I suspect it has its own positives and its own challenges. I think so. One of the positives is the fact that just stepping out, for example, of my Ugandan context, helped me view the church on a broader, wider, if I might say, universal or Catholic sort of like aspect. The fact that God's church is bigger than what I experience in Uganda. It's bigger than what I experience in Kampala. And just having that, experiencing the body of Christ in the US, for example, in New England, was quite a beautiful picture. I think it's G.K. Chesterton in his book, Everlasting Man, who mentions the idea that the second best thing to happen to any boy or any child is, so the first best is to be at home, but the second best is to move away from home so that they can see their home in a different perspective, in contrast to the landscape where it is built. And I think there is that sense of the zooming in into your culture, but which is quite helped by the zooming out of your culture to be able to actually relate your own home to the broader terrain and geography and people groups, so to speak. So that's one advantage. The other that I was sharing at one missions, in one of our research conference and seminar was, as I was reading I was reading the autobiography of Thomas C. Oden. And so Thomas Oden wrote a book, How Africa Shaped the Christian Mind. And it's a book that I read in my first semester, I think, if I remember correctly, when I was starting my Master of Divinity at Gordon Conwell. I had never known the riches of African Christianity before I went to Gordon Conwell. Yes, of course, I had heard the name Augustine. I had read Athanasius is on the Incarnation, but I hadn't read those two works as works of an African church father. I had read them just as works of a church father generally. Yeah. But the case that Oden makes for the riches and the heritage of African Christianity was profound. But I realized that I got to encounter that book and David E. Wilhite, he's at Baylor, Ancient African Christianity. Those two works made me appreciate the work of God on the African continent. Yeah. And I don't think I would have done that if I had just stayed in my context. Now, the challenge is, or at least one of the challenges, was that as I was training in the Western world, as I was training at Gordon Conwell, the temptation was, to be well equipped for the American context, because the professors that I interact with are basically by and large training people for their context. Mm-hmm. And so the temptation is to be well equipped and trained for an American context that I'm actually not that much helpful or useful for my Ugandan context. And so what I had to do, and I remember reading John Samuel Mbiti, a Kenyan theologian as well. And he did mention that challenge, that he gives an example of this gentleman or this person who goes outside Africa, trains theologically, he is great. His theological stand, so he can reason many things, but he comes and he comes back to Africa, and there is this demon-possessed person. Mm-hmm. And you are put in a room with a demon-possessed person, and you have no clue what to do. But in the African context, that's something you should be able to deal with or wrestle with, because it's common. It's not like they are strange. Yeah. But as Kamwende was mentioning, in a sense, in the Western context, that there is a sort of level of rationalism that tends to eliminate, even though people might believe demons exist, they might believe the angels exist, but in the daily lives, they tend to remove these realities. Yeah. Now, when you train from the West, if you're not careful, that will be the case. So when you go back home and you encounter a demon-possessed person, you will have no help. You will be of no help to them. And if you can't be of help to them, you actually have lost an opportunity for ministry in Uganda and African context. And so being careful that you, even when you're trained in the US, in the UK, in Australia,
Yeah.
you are not so much prepared for those sort of contexts that you are rendered probably not as useful or effective for your home context as you could have been.
It makes me think of a essay that I wrote in one of my theology subjects, and it was a very broad topic. The lecturer asked us to write, what is a Christian definition of identity? And I started doing research for that. And I read book after book after book, and they were all talking about how with a Christian identity, your identity doesn't come from your sexuality, it doesn't come from your whatever. It doesn't come from within yourself even, it comes from scripture. And I was just like, these are not the questions I'm asking. Like, this is not impacting me at all. Like, my question of what it means for me to be an African woman, what my identity, those are not the questions that I have, because in a Western context, the questions are, this whole thing of look within, and lots of the theologians were arguing against that, being like, no, our identity needs to come from Christ. But my question was from the plethora of identities that I understand myself as, because I don't look within. That's just not a Kenyan worldview. It's a nonsensical concept. I know that I am a daughter. My identity is that I am a sister. My identity is that I am this woman's grandchild. My identity is those things. And my identity is that I'm a Christian. And so my questions were about, how do I reconcile my identity as an African woman to my identity as a Christian? And I couldn't find any helpful answers in the authors that were the main ones on the top of the bibliographies. And so then I had to go looking for African authors, and that's where it was like speaking to my soul. That was one of the most impassioned essays I've ever written because I was able to find people who were answering the questions that I was asking. And unless I had I had to look in different places to find those answers, because the Western authors and theologians, they just weren't answering those questions that would require the answers that I needed. And it was, in moments like that I realized, it's not sufficient to simply be directed to the main thinkers of current Western theology for my specific context and for this context that I'm going to be going into.
Well, it is great to go to another context, in this case to do Bible college. A person needs to be aware of that, not like your resources are not diverse and not from the global church, but from a specific group of people in Western context, of course.
And I guess Kamwende's experience tells us the work of Langham, why we are encouraging scholars from the majority world to write for the majority world, because sometimes we just can't rely on Western resources, because the resources are produced in the Western context for Western audience, and sometimes it's just not applicable. And I guess it's easy to think of theological training is for ministry, and so it's easy to think, I go to a Bible college, I get equipped for ministry. So I remember when I was considering Bible college, my pastor encouraged me to stay for training because I was just going to be equipped for ministry in that context. But actually, one of the church leaders encouraged me to go overseas to broaden my worldview. Because she believes that going to Bible college is more than just learning the Bible, getting head knowledge, knowing theology, but it's also to be challenged, to think about how and why we do ministry, and to get experience from other churches. And so that's why in the end, I came to Australia for my training. And I agree with Joseph's temptation. If we are trained in a Western context and the temptation is to learn the way how the Westerners do church. But I guess I am very blessed. Even when I was at a Bible college, we were encouraged to think about contextualization. And it was actually the first time ever I heard about the word contextualization because I grew up in a monocultural society. We just do things in a particular way, just cater for one particular culture. So really challenged me to think about contextualization. And I guess Australia is just so multicultural. All the churches, even just monocultural churches in Australia, are forced to think about contextualization because our neighbors are from different backgrounds. And we, I myself at least, have been challenged to think about why we do church, why we do evangelism in a certain way. Is it cultural or is it theological?
Right.
Yeah, I have been asking this question a lot.
You say that because Australia is a very multicultural place, but maybe some pastors are not aware of that because, they think, the gospel is the gospel, so it speaks to everyone.
Yeah, actually, if I could just comment on that, listening to Crystal, it made me think think of another aspect. The temptation is not just to think, I'm going to minister, I'm going to be equipped to minister in the Western context. But the temptation is also to think the Western way of doing things is the best way. And I think that is a very increasing, it's a subtle but quite prevalent way of thinking that you'll find in Western institutions. It's the 21st century, so no one's going to say that. But you look back in the 20th century, you look back on the 19th century, that was completely the thinking. That was the understanding. The Western civilization is the best civilization, and hence colonialism, hence we can go and tell other people how to do things because we're the best. And I think it needs to be recognized that is the legacy of Western institutions, and that understanding is still it's still there in the air, subtly, I think, in lots of Western academic institutions. And so I think the temptation is to be influenced by that and then to go back to your own context and think, okay, here I am to tell you how to do things right, because the Westerners have told me, and I am here to tell you. And I think that is a danger that needs to be avoided because it's essentially it's a colonial sort of very messed up mindset.
Yeah, which is much built on, I think, social Darwinism.
Yeah, exactly.
If I put it that way. Darwin's descent of morals. But back to the point that the question that you do raise, the idea that, we just preach the gospel, right? And it is true that the gospel is universal. It's true that the gospel is good news to everyone, every culture, every person, wherever they are. What I like saying often is that the gospel, at least as we have it, the truth as we have it in Scripture, is painted on the canvas of history and culture. So it's not existing in a vacuum per se, but actually it's the eternal truth, but revealed on the backdrop of a whole cloth, if I might, or fabric, if I might put it that way, and that's culture and history. And
that's good.
And the best thing to do as people, as ministers, as teachers, as Christians, is to be sure that we actually understand what that gospel is. Because most times we can confuse the cultural expression of the gospel with the gospel itself. And so I can't remember who it was who gave this illustration that I think it was probably Greenland or a place that is too cold when they were told that hell is hot. It's fire and all that, and this person was like, I would love to go to hell. Because all they've known is this freezing coldness, and they just imagine this hot place, how amazing and pleasing it could be.
Fire everywhere. What a dream.
And so to such a person, the contextualization would be thinking about how to communicate the idea of judgment in that regard in a way that it creates the fear that it should, rather than actually repeating the same thing that you think would work to Western or African, even in many African contexts, and thinking it will work for them. And so the gospel it's an eternal truth that is indeed Catholic, and it cuts across cultures and all that, but it tends to be painted on a canvas, and it's good to discern that canvas rather than actually assume that the whole canvas and the picture that emerges are what the gospel is.
Yeah, and I guess for Bible colleges students, whether they do it in their own context or those who are privileged to go overseas and do it in a different context. As also, one thing is important to bear in mind is that Bible college training is never sufficient. It just gives you the way of thinking, not just the knowledge. I guess we can't just copy and stay wherever we are. We learn ABC and we just have ABC for the rest of our lives. And the pandemic really forces us to think, actually, it's not enough. Like, for example, during the pandemic, pastors around the world were struggling to preach online because they were never taught to preach online at Bible college. And I guess it was just an example to tell us that we have to do contextualization constantly because the world is changing. And what Bible college training gives us is just a way of thinking, a way to open our mind. And this is what John Stott says. We have a God-given responsibility to infiltrate the world, listening to the world's challenges, but also bring our own challenge to the world by sharing the good news by word and deed. So we share the good news by word and deed. But the first step is to actually listen to the world so that we can respond to the world.
Well, I hope that you found this conversation quite insightful. I certainly have so much to think about right now because of this conversation. But one of the things that I really appreciated and is kind of my takeaway from this conversation is that the idea of going out of your own context and being in a different context, how that helps you to reflect on your own background and seeing your own blind spots and also seeing the blind spots of the context you find yourself in. So I think that there's really value in that. But I also wanted to ask Simon, for you, from your Australian perspective, what are your thoughts on this?
I think I'm still digesting some of this stuff, but I think the first and most important thing is to realize that the Western viewpoint isn't the blank canvas that we all too often think that it is. I think we seriously, secretly still think that we're a little bit better than the rest of the world. And I think I still have some of that as well, to think secretly that the Western mindset is better. So we take the Western mindset as the blank canvas. Either we say the Western mindset is just the start, the start of the viewpoint and everything else is a deviation, or we secretly harbor the idea that we're better and we just don't want to voice it. We've managed to get to the point where we're like, all right, so this is a socially uncomfortable thing for us to say, but secretly we think that, and it's like we need to think about that and repent of it.
Thank you so much for listening. I have great news. Our conversation with Crystal, Kamwende, and Joseph is not over yet. Next episode, we will continue our conversation on contextualization, and this time we will be talking about language and history and why they are so important when understanding a context. So please make sure you listen to part 2 of this conversation. And please don't forget to share the episode with friends and leave us a review to support this podcast. See you next time.